This isn't a video you watch, it's one you listen to or read. Because what matters here isn't what you see.
There was a time when silence was normal, not something you had to create, not something you had to protect, just something that existed. No notifications, no vibrations, no invisible pressure pulling your attention away every few seconds. People left their homes and disappeared. Not because something was wrong, but because that was life. If you wanted to reach someone, you had to wait. And in that waiting, something important existed. Space. Space to think, space to feel, space to exist without interruption. But then something changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. In 1973, a man stood on a street in New York holding a device that didn't belong to that world. His name was Martin Cooper, and when he made that call, he wasn't just speaking to another person, he was speaking to the future. At that moment, communication broke free from place. No more walls, no more wires, no more limits tied to location. The voice became mobile. And for the first time, the human being became reachable anywhere. It felt like progress, and it was, but every form of progress creates a new expectation, and every new expectation begins to reshape behavior. At first, the phone was just a tool, large, heavy, rare, something you carried for necessity, not something that carried you. But technology never stays in its original form. It evolves, it moves closer, it becomes faster, more accessible, more personal, until one day it stops being something you use and becomes something that starts to use you. And the most dangerous part is you don't notice when it happens, because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like convenience. It feels like connection. It feels like life. But what if the device that was created to connect humanity slowly began to reshape the human mind itself? What if the real revolution of the cell phone was not what it did to the world, but what it did to you? The first cell phone was never meant to dominate your life. It was meant to solve a problem. For decades, communication had limits. If you weren't in the right place at the right time, you simply could not be reached. That limitation shaped everything. Plans had structure, conversations had intention, silence had meaning. When Martin Cooper made that call in 1973, he wasn't trying to create dependence. He was trying to remove friction. And that's where the shift begins, because every time technology removes friction, it also removes resistance. And resistance is what protects human behavior. At first, the cell phone was rare. It was expensive, bulky, restricted to business and high-level communication. In 1983, when the first commercial cell phone entered the market, it wasn't a personal device. It was a status symbol, something that signaled power, urgency, importance. People didn't check it constantly. They used it when necessary. There was still distance between the human and the device, but that distance didn't last, because technology always follows the same path. It starts exclusive, then becomes accessible, then becomes essential. And once something becomes essential, it begins to change how people live. As networks expanded and devices became smaller, the phone moved closer to the body, from the car to the hand to the pocket, and each step made access easier. Calls became faster, messages became simpler, connection became immediate, and something subtle started to happen. Availability became expectation. People no longer ask, "Can I reach you?" They assume you should be reachable. And that assumption changed everything. Because once people expect access, they begin to expect response. And once response becomes expected, silence starts to feel wrong. Not peaceful, not natural, but uncomfortable. The phone didn't just connect people, it changed how absence is perceived. It redefined what it means to be unavailable. And that is where the psychological shift begins. Because the human mind was never designed to be constantly reachable. It was designed for cycles, presence and absence, engagement and recovery, connection and solitude. But the cell phone began to collapse those cycles, not all at once, but gradually, until the space between interactions started to disappear. And when space disappears, something deeper begins to erode. Attention, because attention requires boundaries, and the phone was quietly removing them. It didn't feel like loss, it felt like improvement. Faster communication, easier contact, more convenience. But beneath that convenience, a new pattern was forming, one where interruption became normal. And once interruption becomes normal, focus becomes fragile. This was still not the smartphone era. The device had not yet taken over your environment. But the foundation was already built, because before a system can control behavior, it first needs access. And the cell phone had already achieved that. It was in your pocket, closer than ever before, and moving even closer. The phone didn't become powerful overnight. It evolved. And every step of that evolution moved it closer to something far more influential than anyone originally intended. In the early 1990s, something changed. The phone began to absorb functions that once belonged to separate tools. In 1994, a device called the IBM Simon entered the market. It wasn't just a phone. It could store contacts, manage schedules, send messages, interact through a screen. It was primitive, slow, limited, incomplete, but it introduced an idea that would redefine everything. The phone was no longer just for communication. It was becoming a system. And when a device becomes a system, it stops being used occasionally. It starts being integrated constantly. This was the moment the phone began its transformation from a tool into an environment. At first, the impact was subtle. People still live mostly outside the device, but the direction was set, because once technology begins to combine functions, it reduces the need for anything else. And when one object becomes capable of doing many things, it becomes central. Central to routine, central to decisions, central to attention. Then came the turning point. In 2007, the iPhone was introduced, and this is where the shift accelerated. Not because it was just better, but because it felt different. The interface changed. Instead of pressing buttons, you touched the screen. Instead of commands, you explored. Instead of using the phone, you interacted with it. This changed behavior instantly, because the device was no longer just functional. It became intuitive, responsive, pleasurable. And that last part matters, because when technology becomes pleasurable, it begins to compete with real life. The phone was no longer just useful. It became engaging, then addictive, and slowly it became necessary. Apps began to emerge, each one designed for a purpose: communication, entertainment, information, social interaction. But beneath those purposes, another layer existed: retention. The goal was no longer just to serve the user, it was to keep the user, to hold attention, to increase time, to create return behavior. And the most effective way to do that is not through logic, it's through psychology. Every notification became a trigger. Every message became anticipation. Every scroll became possibility. The brain responds to uncertainty, to reward, to novelty. And the smartphone delivered all three continuously. This is when the relationship changed. You were no longer just using the phone, The phone was beginning to shape how you think, because attention is not just something you have, it is something that can be trained. And the smartphone became the most powerful training system ever placed in human hands. Small enough to stay with you, smart enough to adapt to you, constant enough to never let your mind fully disconnect. And the result was subtle at first. Shorter focus, more distraction, less tolerance for stillness. But over time, those small changes began to accumulate until one day, being alone with your own thoughts no longer felt natural because something had taken its place. A constant stream of input, always available, always waiting, always ready to fill the silence. And when silence disappears, so does something else. Clarity. What changed was not just the device. What changed was the human mind. Because once the smartphone became constant, your attention stopped being stable. And when attention is no longer stable, everything else begins to shift. Focus becomes harder to sustain, thought becomes fragmented, presence becomes divided, not because something is wrong with you, but because something changed in the environment around you. The human brain was not designed for continuous stimulation. It was designed for cycles, moments of engagement, followed by moments of rest, moments of input, followed by moments of reflection. But the smartphone removed those pauses. It filled every gap. Waiting in line became scrolling. Walking became checking. Silence became noise. At first, it feels efficient. You're using your time, staying informed, staying connected, but something deeper is happening. Your brain never fully stops receiving input. And when the brain doesn't pause, it doesn't reset. This is where mental fatigue begins. Not from effort, but from constant switching, message, video, notification, thought, interruption, return, again and again. Each switch may feel small, but the cost accumulates because every interruption breaks continuity. And continuity is what allows deep thinking. Without it, your mind stays on the surface, reactive, responsive, never fully engaged. This is why so many people today feel mentally tired, even when they haven't done anything physically demanding. Their body is still, but their attention is constantly moving. And attention uses energy more than most people realize. The phone doesn't just demand time, it demands processing. Every image, every notification, every piece of information is something your brain must interpret, decide, ignore, respond, store, dismiss, and that process never stops, which means your brain never fully rests. This also changes how you experience reality because attention defines experience. What you focus on becomes your reality. But when your focus is constantly interrupted, your experience becomes fragmented. Moments lose depth. Conversations lose presence. Thoughts lose continuity. You may be physically somewhere, but mentally you are always partially elsewhere. This is where something important is lost. Not information, not connection, but immersion. The ability to be fully present in a single moment without needing something else. And without immersion, life begins to feel shallow. Not because it is, but because your attention is no longer deep enough to experience it. The smartphone didn't just give you access to the world, it divided your experience of it. And once that division becomes normal, it becomes invisible. You stop noticing it, you adapt to it, until one day you try to sit in silence and something feels off. Not because silence changed, but because your mind did. Because it is no longer used to being alone without stimulation. And that may be one of the most significant shifts of all, the loss of internal stillness. Because without stillness, clarity becomes rare. And without clarity, everything else becomes harder. At some point, the phone stopped being something you reach for and became something you return to. Not because you need it, but because something in your mind expects it. This is where the shift becomes deeper because behavior turns into habit. And habit, repeated enough times, starts to feel like identity. You don't think about checking your phone, you just do it. A pause in conversation, a moment of waiting, a slight discomfort. Your hand moves automatically, not consciously, but conditioned. And this is not random, it is learned. Because every time you check your phone and find something, a message, a notification, a new piece of content, your brain receives a small reward. Not always, but sometimes. And that unpredictability is what makes it powerful. Because the brain responds more strongly to uncertain rewards than to predictable ones. You don't know what you'll find, but there might be something. And that might is enough to keep you coming back again and again. Over time, this creates a loop. Trigger, action, reward. And once that loop stabilizes, it no longer needs your attention. It runs automatically. This is when the phone moves beyond being a tool. It becomes a system that interacts directly with your behavior. And the more it learns about you, the more precise it becomes. What you watch, what you click, what you pause on, what you return to, all of it feeds back into the system, and the system adapts, not to help you focus, but to help you stay longer, more often, more consistently. This is why it becomes harder to stop, not because you lack discipline, but because you're interacting with something designed to hold your attention. And attention is not unlimited, it is a resource. And like any resource, it can be used or extracted. The phone extracts it in small amounts, seconds here, minutes there, until those fragments become hours. And those hours become patterns. And those patterns become your daily life. This also changes how you relate to yourself, because constant input leaves little room for internal processing. You react more, but reflect less. You consume more, but integrate less. And over time, that imbalance creates something subtle: mental noise, thoughts that never fully form, ideas that never fully develop, feelings that never fully settle. Because the mind is always moving to the next input, and without time to process, clarity begins to fade. This is why so many people feel like their mind is always active, but rarely clear, always thinking, but not always understanding, always engaged, but rarely at rest. And the deeper consequence is this: you begin to lose contact with your own internal rhythm, because your attention is no longer guided from within. It is guided by what appears next. And when that happens, something fundamental shifts. You are no longer choosing where your attention goes. Your attention is being directed, not forcefully, but continuously. And over time, that direction becomes your default state. The most powerful change was not speed, it was presence, or more precisely, the loss of it. Because before the phone became constant, being somewhere meant being there. Your attention followed your body, your mind stayed with the moment. Conversations had weight, silence had space, time had depth. But the smartphone introduced something new: a second layer of reality, always available, always active, always competing with the moment in front of you. Now, you can be in a room and not be in it. You can sit across from someone and only partially hear them. You can walk through a place without ever fully experiencing it, because part of your attention is always somewhere else, not intentionally, but constantly. This is what divided presence looks like. And it doesn't feel like loss. It feels normal because it happens everywhere. Train stations filled with people looking down instead of around, families sitting together while each person is in a different digital space. Moments shared physically, but not mentally. The phone did not remove connection, it redistributed it. It expanded it globally while thinning it locally. You can talk to anyone, anywhere, but often at the cost of fully being with the person right in front of you. And over time, this changes relationships because connection is not just about access, it is about attention. And attention is what makes someone feel seen, heard, valued. But when attention is divided, so is connection. Even if the conversation continues, even if the words are exchanged, something subtle is missing: depth. Because depth requires uninterrupted presence, and uninterrupted presence has become rare. The phone also changed how you experience time. Moments that once stretched now collapse. Waiting becomes scrolling. Stillness becomes consumption. There's no empty space left. And without empty space, the mind never expands because expansion happens in pause, in reflection, in silence. But silence has been replaced, not by necessity, but by availability. The phone is always there, ready to fill the gap. And over time, you stop tolerating the gap itself. You begin to avoid it, even unconsciously. A few seconds of nothing start to feel uncomfortable, and discomfort triggers action. You reach for the device again without thinking, because the brain learns quickly. If something removes discomfort, it becomes the preferred response. And the phone does this perfectly, instantly, effortlessly, every time. But there is a cost, because when every moment is filled, nothing is processed, nothing settles, nothing integrates. Life becomes continuous input without internal resolution. And that creates a strange state. You experience more, but understand less. You see more, but reflect less. You engage constantly, but rarely feel fully present. And slowly, this becomes your baseline, not because you chose it, but because you adapted to it. And adaptation, when repeated long enough, becomes identity. At some point, this stopped being about technology and became about awareness, because everything the phone changed happened slowly, gradually, quietly enough that most people never questioned it. They adapted, they adjusted, they accepted it as normal. But normal does not always mean natural, and it does not always mean harmless. The human mind is incredibly flexible. It can adapt to almost any environment. But adaptation has a cost, and that cost is often invisible until it becomes permanent. The question is no longer what the phone can do. We already know that. The real question is what it has been training you to become, because every interaction teaches your brain something. Every notification reinforces a pattern. Every interruption reshapes your focus. Every moment of distraction rewires your response to stillness. And over time, these patterns become automatic. You don't choose them anymore, you live them. This is why stepping away feels harder than it should. Not because you lack control, but because your brain has been trained to expect constant input, to avoid silence, to seek stimulation. And when that stimulation is removed, something feels wrong, not physically, but mentally. A subtle tension, a need to check, a pull toward the device, and that pull is not random, it is learned. But if something can be learned, it can also be unlearned. And this is where the shift begins. Not in rejecting the phone, not in disconnecting from the world, but in recognizing the influence it has on your attention. Because attention is one of the most valuable things you have. It shapes how you think, how you feel, how you experience life. And if your attention is constantly directed outward, you slowly lose access to what is happening inside. That is why reclaiming attention is not just about focus. It is about awareness. It is about choosing where your mind goes instead of letting it be guided by whatever appears next. This does not happen all at once. It starts with small moments, not reaching immediately, not reacting instantly, allowing silence to exist without needing to fill it. And at first, it feels unfamiliar because you are no longer following the pattern you've been repeating. But with time, something changes. Your thoughts slow down, your attention stabilizes, your mind becomes clearer, not because the world changed, but because your relationship with it did. And this is where something important becomes clear. The phone never truly controlled you. It influenced you continuously, subtly, but powerfully. And once you see that influence, you have a choice to continue as before or to take back control of the one thing that defines your entire experience, your attention. Recovery does not happen all at once. It begins quietly, almost unnoticed. A moment where you don't reach for the phone, a pause that lasts a little longer than usual, a thought that completes itself without interruption. At first, it feels small, insignificant, because the mind has been conditioned to expect constant input, to move quickly, to react immediately, to fill every space. But when that pattern is interrupted, even briefly, something begins to return. Clarity, not suddenly, not perfectly, but gradually. You start to notice things you used to overlook. The pace of your own thoughts, the weight of a conversation, the feeling of being fully present in a moment without needing to capture it or share it. And for the first time in a long time, your attention stays with you. This is where the shift deepens because clarity is not created. It is revealed when interference is reduced. The problem was never that your mind stopped working. It was that it never stopped receiving. And once that input slows down, your system begins to stabilize. Thoughts become more coherent. Focus becomes easier to sustain. Decisions feel less scattered. Not because life became simpler, but because your mind is no longer divided in the same way. And this matters because the modern world does not demand less from you. It demands more information, more decisions, more adaptation. And without clarity, that demand becomes overwhelming. This is why so many people feel mentally drained without understanding why. Not from lack of effort, but from lack of stability. And in a world where your attention is constantly pulled, supporting your mental clarity becomes essential, not as a shortcut, not as a replacement for awareness, but as support for a system under continuous pressure. If you feel like your mind is not as sharp as before, like your focus fades too quickly, like your thoughts don't stay organized the way they used to, there are ways to support that process. For daily mental clarity and focus, one option is Synaptogen, http://synaptogen24.com/text.php# AFF equals mysteries, the echo. Some people also look for additional support focused on mental energy and cognitive performance, such as Brain AMP, https://www.advancedbionutritionals.com/ds2/brain-amp/brain-switch-on/hd.html#mysteries, the echo, not as a solution on their own, but as tools that may support the mind in an environment that constantly challenges it. Because the goal is not to escape the modern world, it is to function within it without losing clarity. And that begins by understanding what changed. not just around you, but within you. The phone did not arrive as a problem, it arrived as a solution. And that is why it became so powerful, because it attached itself to something deeply human: the need to connect, the need to belong, the need to not feel alone. That is what made it successful, not the technology itself, but the way it aligned with human desire. And once that connection was established, everything built on top of it became easier to accept. More features, more access, more integration, until the device was no longer something external. It became part of your daily existence, part of your decisions, part of your reactions, part of your identity. And the deeper it integrated, the harder it became to question. Because you don't question what feels essential. You adapt to it, you justify it, you normalize it, even when it changes you. This is how large shifts happen, not through resistance, but through acceptance. And the more invisible the change, the more permanent it becomes, because it stops being noticed. The phone is no longer new. It is no longer impressive. It is expected, and expectation is what locks behavior in place. You wake up and reach for it, you pause and check it, you feel something and respond through it. Not because you decided to, but because it became your default. And when something becomes default, it defines how you live. This is where the real question emerges. Not about the device, but about direction. Because if your attention is constantly guided by something external, then your internal direction becomes weaker. You react more than you choose. You respond more than you reflect. You follow more than you decide. And over time, that changes how you experience yourself, because identity is built through attention. What you focus on consistently becomes what shapes you. And if that focus is fragmented, your experience of yourself becomes fragmented too. This is not about rejecting technology, it is about understanding its role, because tools are not neutral once they begin to shape behavior. And the cell phone, especially in its modern form, is not just a tool, it is an influence. Constant, subtle, persistent, and like any influence, it either supports your clarity or competes with it. The difference is not in the device, it is in awareness. Because once you become aware, you begin to see the pattern. And once you see the pattern, you are no longer inside it the same way. You begin to question, not everything, but enough to create space. And space is where control begins to return. What comes next is not a new device, not a new upgrade, not another version of the same system. What comes next depends on something else: awareness. Because for the first time since that call in 1973, the question is no longer about innovation, it is about direction. The technology will continue to evolve, faster, smarter, more integrated. It will move closer to your habits, closer to your decisions, closer to your identity. But the closer it gets, the more important it becomes to understand your relationship with it. Because this is no longer just about communication. It is about how you think, how you feel, how you focus, how you live. And something else changed. Something subtle, but deeply human. We stopped being present with each other. Conversations became shorter, eye contact became rarer, moments together became divided. We are connected to everyone, but often distant from the person in front of us. Families sit together, but each mind is somewhere else. Friends meet, but attention is shared with the screen. We talk more than ever before, but we connect less, not because we lost the ability, but because something started competing for our attention. And slowly, we accepted it. Some will continue, as they always have, reacting, scrolling, consuming, moving from one input to the next, always connected but rarely present. And for them, nothing will seem wrong because everything will feel normal. But others will begin to notice the patterns, the interruptions, the fragmentation. And once they notice, they will begin to change something small, not rejecting the device, but redefining its place, creating moments without it, looking at people again, listening fully, being there completely. And in those moments, something begins to return: clarity, focus, presence, human connection, not through a screen, but in real life. And once you feel that difference, you understand something most people never stop to consider. The system was never designed to slow down for you. It was designed to keep you engaged. And if you don't create distance, it will continue to take more than it gives, not all at once, but gradually, through attention, through habit, through repetition, until your time, your focus, and your connection with real people are no longer fully yours. This is not a warning, it is a realization, because the device that connected the world did something else at the same time. It changed how we connect with each other. And once you understand that, you see it differently, you use it differently, you live differently, not disconnected, but aware. And that awareness may be the only thing that separates someone who is guided by the system from someone who chooses their own direction. Because the cell phone did not just change communication, it changed humanity. And the question that remains is simple. Now that you know, what will you do with it?